From Heterodox Academy, this is Half Hour of Heterodoxy. Conversations with scholars and authors, ideas from diverse viewpoints and perspectives. Here's your host, Chris Martin.
Joanna Schug is my guest today. She's a social and cross-cultural psychologist at the College of William and Mary, and she's also a friend of mine. We're talking about cultural differences and how the concept of relational mobility helps us understand why cultures differ from one another and why people can have difficulty adapting to a new culture. For a long time, we've described cultures in terms of individualism or collectivism, but there are limitations to those terms. Joanna and I discuss how we can interpret cultural behavior better if we think about high and low relational mobility. I think a lot of people have some sense of what the words individualism and collectivism mean, but tell me about some of the limitations we have if we try to understand the world through that lens.
It seems like when people talk about individualism, collectivism, different people have different ideas of what it means. So, you can go back in the literature for the past 50 years and see, all different types of individualism and collectivism. And, we can look at like horizontal or vertical or, Hofstede's measures. And it just seems like people have an idea about what individualism and collectivism is, but in many cases, the data don't fit their predictions based on that idea. And so they've kind of had to try to figure out how to get around this concept or how to narrow it down to like different dimensions of individualism and collectivism. And so, one thing that I think relational mobility does a pretty decent job of explaining is this kind of idea about how much intimacy and closeness people have in their relationships. I think in many cases, especially when North Americans think about collectivism, we like to think of, a place where people sacrifice their self-interest for the sake of the group or the collective. And then we also kind of throw in this idea that they do that because they want to do that. So, maybe it's because we also have this tendency to make internal attributions for behavior, but we observe people who are behaving in collectivistic ways, and we assume that they do that because they like to do that, right? And in the case of collectivism, we think that they like other people or that they enjoy cooperating with other people. When at least the research comparing North America and East Asia seems to suggest that that's not really the case, right? People in East Asian contexts, in many cases, don't like cooperating with the group. Toshio Yamagishi's classic research showed that Americans are actually more likely to stay with their groups compared to Japanese when things start, going wrong in the group. Because, the Americans are trying to like stick with the group and the Japanese actually don't want to. So if you give them an out, they'll take it. But in most cases in Japanese society, they can't get out of their groups, right? So if you put them in a situation where they can, they're more than happy to do so, even more so than Americans. So I think relational mobility will, or at least is trying to address this kind of discrepancy. It can help explain why people might behave in other regarding ways, even when they don't necessarily like their groups.
Yeah, I guess this would be a good point to jump to a definition. So what's a good definition of relational mobility?
Yeah, if you go back and look at our papers, we use several different definitions, but the idea is that your social environment provides you with opportunities to choose new relationships. So you have opportunities to meet new people, choose the groups that you belong to, but you also have the opportunity to cut off current relationships if you want to. So I think a lot of people assume that relational mobility means that people are just changing their relationships all the time, but that's not the case. So if you are happy in your relationship, of course, you're not going to move. But if you're somehow not benefiting from your relationship, your partner's not good to you, you're not happy in some way. The idea is that you have other options out there, right? And you'd be able to leave that current relationship or change the nature of that relationship, but move to a new, more beneficial relationship. And so this is an aspect of the society, right? So different societies will provide people with more or less opportunities to meet new people, or different societies might make it difficult to leave certain types of relationships. So marriage might be a good example of this. In some contexts, it's much more difficult to get a divorce than in other contexts. And so the idea is that relational mobility is something about the society in which people are a part of.
A typical example of a city or place that's really high in relational mobility is New York City, because people are constantly meeting new people there and dropping old friendships and starting new ones. Are there any places in America that might be examples of low relational mobility?
Well, I mean, I have data that are not published, unfortunately, so take this with a grain of salt, but we did a survey comparing different states in the United States, and this was several years ago. And it actually, I think the highest level of relational mobility was Texas in that data set. Who knows if that would pan out. New York, I don't know if we looked at the city versus the state, but I don't believe it was the highest. The lowest was actually West Virginia. So we actually measured relational mobility in that data set as the number of new acquaintances someone had met over the past week. And the mean for West Virginia in that data set was 0.
Wow. Yeah.
It was the only state with a 0. But that, take that with a grain of salt, because there were pretty few observations from West Virginia to begin with compared to some of the other states.
Yeah. I mean, in that case, I think maybe poverty is a confound too.
It could be poverty. I mean, it could be where people are living. If you're living in a rural community and you only come into contact with your neighbors, there's probably not a lot of opportunities to meet new people.
Yeah.
Certainly having more money lets you explore your environment more and go out and meet people. And you also, as an individual, become more attractive to others, which is another component similar to relational mobility, but it's more about the individual rather than the society. But if I am a wealthy person, chances are the people around me are also wealthy. And so collectively, we probably have more opportunities to form relationships than other people.
And do you think it would be fair to say that in high relational mobility societies, you have to prove your worth? So in a way, you turn yourself into a commodity, not consciously, but in a sort of subtle way. You try to show ways in which you are a better friend or a better romantic partner.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a big part of the theory, is that, in a high mobility society, it's like an open marketplace of relationships. So you need to demonstrate your worth to others to be chosen, and also to choose others, right? So there's two sides of the coin. I have to have opportunities to meet new people, but also I need to get other people to want to be my friend or form relationships with me. And also I want them to stick around. So our research shows that people tend to be more invested and engage in more relationship maintenance behavior, like proactive relationship maintenance behavior. So more self-disclosure, right? Higher levels of intimacy. Junko Yamada, one of my Kohai, so she's from the same graduate program in Hokkaido University. Kohai is the Japanese word for someone who is part of the same general's class, but younger, I guess. Or
okay.
Yeah. It doesn't really translate well, but anyway, but she has a good, interesting line of research that looks at romantic passion. And so in contexts where there's higher relational mobility, people tend to feel more passionate about their relationships, because that passion actually serves as a commitment mechanism to keep oneself in the relationship and encourage other people to stay with you in the relationship. And then, you think about, okay, how am I going to make people want to be my friend or be my partner in a high relational mobility society, right? I'm going to have to market myself, maybe find a niche that only I can fulfill that other people can't. Because if I'm going to be competing with a lot of other people in a general domain, that's going to be more difficult than finding like a smaller domain to, potentially, market myself in, right? So I might be like really into a certain type of like strange music, like say Oingo Boingo or something like that, so I can market that to other weird people who might like that kind of weird 80s music, or something like that, right? So that might help me market my strengths or my ability or my unique esoteric interests to make me more of a desirable interaction partner to other people in high mobility environments.
Right. And What are some examples of countries that are low in relational mobility? I know Japan is one, but
Yeah, so we have a large cross-cultural study that we did actually using advertisements on Facebook. So we actually put advertisements into people's news feeds that kind of looked like a little one of those BuzzFeed quizzes, if you remember those. They'll tell you which Disney princess you would be. So we put a very similar type of quiz that's like, tell us about your relationships. How does your relationship compare to other people? And it was designed very nicely. And so quite a few people clicked on this. I think we got over 16,000 participants around the world. And so we only surveyed countries that had pretty high Facebook market penetration. So the lowest relational mobility societies were East Asia, so Japan, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Northern Africa. We don't have any countries, unfortunately, from the sub-Saharan Africa, because there's not a lot of Facebook market penetration there, unfortunately. But we do have, countries like Morocco and Tunisia, and they do tend to have lower relational mobility.
And that's a self-report way of measuring it. What other ways are people looking into right now in terms of ways to measure it?
Yeah. So I'm always interested in looking at the number of new acquaintances that people are meeting. It doesn't really work well on an individual level, because there's just so much variation there. But if you were to aggregate that on a societal level, I think that could be a measure. Other people have looked at divorce rates. So divorce rates, and probably better than divorce rates, would be remarriage rates after a divorce. So that could be a good proxy of relational mobility. I would love to find other ways to measure this, maybe looking at, following people over the course of a day and finding out, like, if they meet someone, how easy would it be to form a relationship with that person? But yeah, it's a difficult construct to measure, especially because we're trying to assess the environment and not necessarily individual attributes of each individual, which is a little bit different than the way things are typically done in psychology.
Can you give me some examples of cultural conflicts or misunderstandings that happen because of differences in relational mobility?
Okay. I can tell you a little bit about my experience in Japan. So I did my graduate work in Japan, so I was there several years. And as an American, I'm kind of used to small talk and talking to people who I might come across, in my daily life, and forming some sort of relationship with them. But I remember when I was I would see a couple of people who worked in the lab across the hall. It's a different program, so I don't really have a lot of opportunities to talk with them. But, there's 7 years of my life where I would pass by this one person in particular, and I'd see him almost every day, probably several times a day. And I knew him, and sometimes I'd see him out like in the community in Sapporo. And because we weren't part of the same group, we didn't really have license to talk to each other. And so it just seemed so odd to me that I would just pass by this person, know his face, and see him around all the time, and never even know who he is. Where if this were the States, I would probably have introduced myself a long time ago. And interestingly, on the day that I defended my dissertation, I guess maybe it was the day I actually received my diploma, we had a big party in the lab, and they were having a party in their lab, and I saw this guy, and we were all drinking beer, as one does in Japan in the lab. And I just, today's the day. It's been 7 years. I'm going to walk across the hall and introduce myself. And, I just introduced myself. And it turns out that he had wanted to talk to me too for the past 7 years, but he just didn't feel like it would be appropriate for him to introduce himself. So anyway, so things like that, like whether it's okay to talk to someone who you haven't met before. I hear a lot of people outside of the United States complain about how superficial Americans are when it comes to forming relationships. So, they'll meet someone on a train and they'll have a conversation, which for Americans is not a big deal. But for them, it's like, wow, I just had a conversation with a stranger. This is amazing. And then they'll be like, oh, hey, you should come visit sometime when you're in my neck of the woods. And they'll think that that's like a really serious personal invitation, right? And so then they'll call this person, and the person doesn't even remember them. And so I hear about that happening a lot, and then I kind of feel like I might be a little bit guilty of that. And when I offer that invitation in the moment, I'm serious, but unless they take it up very quickly, it kind of dissolves and I don't really think about it much after that. But so things like that, like whether it's okay to form new relationships with strangers. Do you talk to strangers? Do you potentially think of them as someone who could be an exchange partner at some point in time?
Yeah. One thing I've noticed is that some Americans also view their parents and family members as just some people in this larger marketplace. And so they opt to keep in touch with them or not keep in touch with them, depending on how much value they perceive in those relationships. Whereas in India, you tend to feel obliged to keep in touch with your parents, regardless. Also in India, you have a much stronger connection with them. And that's a generalization. Of course, many Americans are very close to their parents. Also, speaking of conversations, you striking up conversations, I realized in India, even though there are more Starbucks now and more coffee shops in general, you just don't strike up conversations with someone in a coffee shop in India. It's just not considered okay.
And even in the States, you mentioned New York as a high mobility environment. I feel like it actually might be kind of a U-shaped curve or an inverted U-shaped curve, where when you have its extremely high population density, there might be an overload of relationships. So I feel like in big cities, people actually talk with each other a little bit less than they would in kind of medium-sized towns, just because there are just so many people everywhere. Like, when you ride the subway in New York, you probably don't strike a conversation with the person next to you. But if you're on the bus in like a rural community, you might.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and in England, from traveling around within England, I know that if you're riding a bus in London, you definitely don't strike up conversations with people. But if you're in Wales, for example, you can easily strike up a conversation with someone in the bus.
More research to do.
Yeah. Well, Wales is beautiful. So if you get a chance to do research there, I would highly recommend it.
All right.
So people have mostly looked at differences in relational mobility through differences across nations or to some degree across regions, wheat growing areas versus rice growing areas. But within a country, do you think we could also look at life stages through the lens of relational mobility? Because as some people get older and start a family, it's just harder to make new friends, and maybe you're less interested in marketing yourself because you have a family now.
Yeah. I definitely think this is the case. I don't have a lot of data, at least I don't have any published data to support this. But what I would imagine is, of course, the lowest level of mobility is probably going to be those people of, when they have young children and they can't really get out as much as they would like to. And they're probably only interacting with the same group of people, probably who are connected also through their children. Whereas if you're a college student, I'm sure you have lots of opportunities. If you just joined a new company, you have a lot of opportunities. And also, I think that people who are retired have a fair amount of relational mobility. And this is somewhat based on just eyeballing data that I have. And it does seem that, people around age 60 seem to have, or at least report, pretty high levels of relational mobility. Again, take this with a grain of salt because I haven't published anything on this, but this is something that made me think at least about why it is that retirees might have higher levels of relational mobility. And it just might be because they have more leisure time, right? That they have more time to get out there. They're probably choosing what they want to do. And maybe they choose to go and, I don't know, go on a cruise or, go out and go fishing, and they might be meeting people as they do so. I like to think of middle school as a good example of what a low mobility society is like. Middle school, I think, is the epitome of low relational mobility. You have a set group of people, everyone knows each other. You're very concerned, because everyone knows each other, about your reputation, right? So if you do something wrong, or you're wearing something that your friends don't like, or you're listening to music that your friends don't like, they're going to gossip about you. So you have to be like on your best behavior, not to make those relationships go bad, right? Like if they see your parents and you're mortified by how embarrassing your parents are and so forth. And so it's kind of like you have to be on your tiptoes all the time about making sure that you are not rocking the boat too much to damage your friendships, because if you damage those friendships, you are out of luck, right? You're not going to move to a new classroom and find a new group or clique of friends. So when I talk about how relationships work in Japan, I think it's very similar to how relationships work in middle school in the United States. I mean, not in necessarily a bad way, but people are very conscious about what other people think about them, right? So if you put yourself in that mindset, you might be better at adapting to a low relational mobility environment.
Right. And there also seems to be a connection between industrialization and relational mobility. So
Yeah.
do you think as the whole world gets more industrialized, relational mobility just across the board will be higher?
Yeah. So one thing that industrialized nations have is they have generally centralized mechanisms at enforcing cooperation. So we have like police systems and so forth that, say I interact with someone and they steal something from me, for instance, like I talk to a stranger danger, they did something bad. In industrialized developed societies, generally we have some mechanism of punishing them, right? And that mechanism of potentially punishing someone for doing something bad to you makes it so that it's easier to actually get out there and start talking to people, right? Because you have that kind of sense of security that you get from this, institutionalized system of cooperation enforcement. In low mobility societies, or maybe developing societies or less industrialized societies, you may not have that, right? You might not have that like external enforcement system. And so the enforcement systems probably become more network based, right? So I only interact with people who I know, and I know that if they do something wrong or they transgress against me, I can get back to them. I can punish them through my interpersonal networks. And so as societies become more industrialized, I would imagine that there is a lot more freedom and ability to interact with people who you don't currently have a relationship through your kind of extended network. But then again, if things get extremely industrialized, like we were just talking about New York City, it might be that there are too many options, right? And then it might be that society then ends up being fragmented. And this is completely theoretical. I have no idea whether this will be the case, but it's something I like to think about, as I'm trying to sleep at night. Like, what happens when you have a completely high mobile society where everyone has options to leave their relationships? And I think what will end up happening is people will assort themselves into fragmented groups, right? Because eventually, if you think of, like, for instance, Thomas Schelling's model of residential segregation, right? Even if you have a very, very small preference for interacting or living near people who are mostly like you, maybe not all like you, even if it's like 51% of your neighborhood, you want to be people like yourself, then eventually with enough mobility, you're going to get complete segregation, right? And I think the same thing would happen with relational mobility. People will probably assort themselves into very fragmented categories, which might inadvertently lower the mobility. So I'll need to pair up with some sort of computer simulation person to do that at some
Right.
point.
I can imagine if you're trying to measure that, you have to measure other things that are happening at the same time in society, like various kinds of polarization that might drive groups apart from each other for entirely other reasons.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it might be the same reason. The polarization could be whatever attribute is being selected for by people. And so they, it could be, if it's politics, you want to move to people who have similar political views. And, if I'm in a low mobility environment, I like where I live now. I mean, it's in the United States, so it's pretty high mobility compared to Japan. But, I live in a kind of not a super urban area, but not a super rural area either. But, there are people around me who have all sorts of different political attitudes, and maybe I might not want to interact with some people, but I have to do that anyway. So, but if I had more mobility, right, in this case, residential mobility, then maybe I would move to somewhere where there are more people who have similar mindsets as my own.
So this is part of a larger school of psychology that's called socio-ecological psychology. Can you talk a little bit about what that larger project is?
The socio-ecological approach is used by, quite a few people now in cultural, cross-cultural, and social psychology to try to link aspects of the social environment in particular to the ways that people think and behave. So relational mobility would be a socio-ecological concept. Residential mobility, you can think of people who are doing work like on the different types of agriculture. So like the culture of honor research, looking at Whether people are living in an area that used to be inhabited by herders as opposed to other types of people, rice versus wheat farming. So these are all examples of socio-ecological approaches. And this is not a new concept. There are people who have done very similar types of research. John Barry, for instance, has what he calls the ecocultural approach, which is very similar. And I would say probably 80% overlap between the social ecological and ecocultural approaches. And so different people use different terms, but it's really trying to understand human behavior and cognition, not as something that comes just from inside the individual, but as something that's adapted to different sorts of social or physical environments. So it's almost getting outside of psychology, right? Psychologists really like thinking about what's going on inside the minds of people, and they're not so good about thinking about what's going on outside of individuals. So it's almost kind of bridging into sociology, fields like human behavioral ecology, things that psychologists traditionally, at least in the United States, haven't focused much on.
Right. Well, before we wrap up, tell me a bit about some future research that you have planned for the next couple of years on relational mobility or anything else cross-cultural.
Well, that's top secret. But I have a lot of things planned. We'll see how much gets completed. I feel like, a kid in a candy store where I want to eat everything, but I know that I'm only going to be able to eat so much. But I was recently fortunate to receive funding to work on larger projects on relational mobility. And what I really want to do is get away from using the scale to measure relational mobility and try to find other ways, particularly using momentary or daily assessment to look at how people are interacting with other people, how they interact with new people, and so forth. And hopefully this will give us a better idea of what relational mobility is. And I think, again, this is a pretty young concept. We've based it on Toshio Yamagishi's classic work on what he calls the emancipation theory of trust. And so we've kind of taken a small portion of his grand theory and have been trying to kind of shine a spotlight on that, which is, the openness of a society and how many opportunities people have to meet and change their relationships if they want to. And we measure that, again, as you mentioned, with the self-report scale, but it would be really great if we can get away from doing that and try to find some sort of objective or less subjective measure of relational mobility.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us on the show.
All right. Thanks for having me.
The next episode of Half Hour of Heterodoxy features Laura Schwartz. She's the director of the Project on Civil Discourse at American University. I'll also be releasing an episode with Steven Pinker's talk at the 2019 Heterodox Academy Conference. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. It helps other people find out about the show. And you can reach me at podcast@heterodoxacademy or on Twitter at chrismartin76. Thanks for listening.
This podcast is produced by Heterodox Academy. Find us online at heterodoxacademy.org, on Twitter at HDX Academy, and on Facebook.